much. I think I will mention that, for what it's worth, my degree is in geology and paleontology. But, I'm just a mess of knowledge. I go with kind of what Ken Ham's organization, Answers in Genesis. I love their material. ICR out of San Diego. These people have PhD scientists working, and they've got answers. And I'm just using their material and passing this along. But I love the subject. I have done a tremendous amount of study in it. And I have found nothing that challenges creationism as opposed to evolution. It's just, and it's not a level playing field. And so that's kind of why I think we need to get the message out. And which, when I came out of college, I was an evolutionist. And a Christian evolutionist, which is almost an oxymoron, but it's it is possible. And I think it is common. You can be a Christian and believe in evolution, but it's a horrible place to be. God did it. God got us where we are today using evolution. Well, no, he didn't. I can't say any more than that. That's where I was. I ran into a debate with Dwayne Gish from ICR against Voorhees from the University of Nebraska, who was a top vertebrate paleontologist in the United States. I went to see Gish get clobbered and got a real shock. Gish, you don't mess with Gish. He knows his material. He's a top biochemist in the United States. He was an industry worker. He was a teacher. And he just literally presented stuff that Voorhees couldn't answer, and I certainly couldn't either. And so I thought, I'm on the wrong side of this argument. So got my hands on material, which was just starting to come out, and I have not changed my mind since. Which brings me to, what is a creationist? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but there is so much confusion when you talk about evolution and creationism. It's sometimes a bait and switch type thing, and evolutionists are not above saying, this is the way it is, when they're actually not talking about what you think they're talking about. And so creationism, just very simply, my definition, and I think it's very close to Answers in Genesis and a lot of these people, and a biblical definition, is someone who believes that the Bible is 100% true. Amen. That's where we've got to start. And we believe, and once you go down that road, then you're saddled with a lot of stuff that's gonna put you at odds with the scientific world. I believe in a worldwide flood. I believe in a 6-day, 24-hour creation. 6,000 years ago. Now, I'm not going to pound the table and say it was 6,000 years, but it was thousands of years, not billions of years. And this is where we are hammered constantly in the media and science and schools and everywhere else. Everywhere you turn, billions, billions, billions. And you got to slap your forehead and say, wait a minute. No, it wasn't billions of years. And once we get that through our minds, we get a whole different perspective of the world and what actually happened. And I have to stop and say, wait a minute, this is not billions of years. And it just gives you a different idea, I think, from the start. Now, the other difference, or main thing that a creationist believes, is that life does not change into something else. In other words, one living thing doesn't change one kind doesn't change into another. Horses don't change into elephants, and on and on and on. Apes don't change into human beings. And so that's a major difference, because that's what evolution says happens. We look at the first chapter of Genesis, and you read where God is creating the different groups, and it says over and over and over, after their kind, which means he created a certain type of animal or plant, and we can still recognize those today. They haven't changed into something else. And so that's a major difference. Now, what does evolution believe? And I like to say this is not your grandmother's evolution. This is atheism in today's world. If you are an evolutionist, as I define it, you have no option but atheism. Because evolution today is not taught as a theory. It's taught as a fact. It's considered to be an absolute fact. And there's absolutely no allowance, or God is not allowed in the conversation. Absolutely not. So what it boils down to is that everything that we see in the world today came about by random chance over time. And that's it. That is evolution. So 2.7 billion years ago, in a pool of chemicals, somewhere, a living cell developed itself and then changed into a more complex type of animal, plant, whatever you want to call it, and eventually, over billions of years, changes into a human being. That's the theory. That's what's taught as fact. And so there is no argument with this. You challenge this in a public school, you'll either get thrown out or you'll get there'll be consequences. So it's not open for discussion in today's world, which is one of the reasons why I started the museum. It's not a level playing field, and the schools are closed. So now the next thing before I get into the nuts and bolts is why. Why do we mess, or why do we waste our time talking about creationism versus evolution? We've got a Bible, we have instructions as Christians. We should be preaching the gospel. We should be preaching salvation through Christ. That's our job. And I don't have a bit of a problem with that. That is what we need to be doing. But the problem that I have is that if evolution is true, then Christ is irrelevant. He has no meaning whatsoever. The Old Testament, if there's parts of the Old Testament that aren't true, then there are parts of the New Testament that are probably questionable also. Where do I stop and draw the line? And so we are under attack, or the Bible is under attack from evolution. They're not attacking who you would think they would attack, which would be Christ himself. They're attacking the Old Testament. Because it shouldn't make any difference to any of us. We can give up the Old Testament, and we can be scientists, and we can be Christian, and we can make this whole thing work, and we can all get along. But that's not the way it works. When you give up the Old Testament, you've given up the whole works. That's right. And so we have to hold on to the Old Testament. Without the Old Testament, we don't have Adam and Eve, we do not have sin, and there is no reason for Christ to have came. So we have to have that foundation of the Old Testament. Kids today are under fire in school. All they hear is billions of years, billions of years. Now when they come home from school, are they going to hear that same thing? They're going to turn the TV on, they're going to hear the same thing. Somebody has to say it's not billions of years. It's thousands of years. The Bible is true, and this is the way it is. Now they're going to have questions, and the question I have is, can you answer their questions? Somebody has to answer their questions. And that's what I think is so important. We need to get the material. We need to be aware of what's going on, because these are the questions they're asking and that they want the answers to. And not only the kids, those people outside the church are concerned. If the Bible's not true, they don't want any part of it. They're not stupid. They know if part of it is wrong, it's all wrong. That's right. So we have to show them that it is true. And that's what I'm going to try to do here is, I'm not going to try to show you that the Bible's true, you know that. So I'm going to try to present you with some evidence that evolution is absolutely false and that we don't have to apologize for what we believe, that we have strong evidence for what we believe from a scientific point of view, that we can say to somebody, look, this is wrong, and here's why it's wrong, and here's why this is right. So with that, I'm going to start with the origin of life. If you have a theory or a fact, which evolution is presented as, that says that life created itself, then I don't think it's asking too much to be able to explain how that happened. Am I wrong? And I was talking to an evolutionist, and I said, okay, how did life start? You've got this theory that says life created itself. How did that happen? He said, that's not our responsibility. Evolution is not responsible for that. We take place after life starts. And I thought, okay. I wish I could use that argument sometimes. But, and of course, I just flat out said, no, you can't do that. You say life creates itself. You got to explain to me how it happened, which he couldn't. And why can't he? That's the question. And this is kind of interesting, and I'm going to have to move along with it. But in 1953, and I love to ask this question, particularly of kids, what was the year in which life was created in the lab? And of course, the answer is life has never been created in the lab. In 1953, however, the headlines went around the world that life has been created in the lab. And Miller and Urey did an experiment in Chicago University, and they were trying to create life. And when they finished their experiment, the headlines went around the world that life had been created in the lab. Well, it's kind of interesting because science, especially evolutionists, have gotten carried away before, and this was another one of those times. What actually happened in that lab? Well, they set up their apparatus and they took chemicals and compounds that they thought were in the early Earth atmosphere, and they put those in a flask and they circulated that through a bunch of test tubes, and they had a trap. And they passed that through 60,000 volts of electricity, simulating lightning, and then they got a product, a very small amount in this trap. Well, they analyzed that trap, the product in the trap, and it was amino acids. Now, amino acids are the building blocks for proteins, which are the building blocks for life. So it doesn't take a big jump to say, okay, we created amino acids, that will create proteins, that will create life, we're there. But it doesn't quite work that way. So, you can't go out in the wild and catch amino acids. They're not there. You can't, basically what it amounts to is the only place there are amino acids are in living things. As fast as you create amino acids in the lab, oxygen destroys them. Unless you keep them under wraps, protected. And so it's a dead end. And somebody said, well, we create them in an oxygenless environment. Well, how's that going to work? I like to breathe. And on top of that, you take the oxygen away, you take the ozone layer away, and we don't breathe and we don't fry, or we do fry. And so it doesn't work. Well, somebody else said, well, let's take it underwater. Some volcanic vent deep in the ocean, and then we'll get away from this oxygen problem. The only problem with that is water also breaks down amino acid and destroys the bonds. So it can't be done. There's another problem which is very interesting. Amino acids come in left and right-handed forms. They're identical chemically, but they're different forms. Now, Miller and Urey created a mix of right and left-handed amino acids when they created this solution. Right-handed amino acids are a poison to life. Life cannot be formed, proteins cannot be formed in the presence of right-handed amino acids. There are 20 left-handed amino acids, and they have to be 100% left-handed amino acids before you can form a protein. And the problems go on and on and on. So I'm just going to stop with that. But the bottom line is you cannot create life chemically. It cannot be done. And every scientist in the world knows that. So Richard Dawkins, who is one of the leading scientists, he's certainly the noisiest, was asked, how does life create itself? Dead silence, for about 15 seconds. And then he says, well, we think maybe the aliens brought it. I think, so that really doesn't work. You're just moving the problem somewhere else. So that's where we're at. We got a theory that says life created itself and no clue as to how it happened. So basically the argument as to whether evolution is viable is over. It can't possibly happen, not chemically. But I'm not going to quit. We'll go on to the next argument. But keep that in mind. Life cannot form chemically in today's world as we know it, and as we know it biologically, genetically, and chemically. It just cannot possibly happen. I like to end this part of it with an illustration, which I call the frog in the blender illustration. You have a frog hopping around on the table. He's alive, he's active, and I have a blender. I plug the blender in, I take the frog, I put him in the blender, I put the lid on. I turn it to puree. Okay, after a little while, I have a frog soup. I pour that out on the table, and there is the frog. Totally, everything is there that was there 5 minutes before. Everything's there. And yet, that frog is dead. Okay, now all I have to do is herd these parts back together and build this frog back up. And I'm back in business. I got a frog. Okay? I can't do it. I've tried. I can't do it. So, it doesn't work. Something's missing. I have all of the chemicals. I've got everything I need there as long as I'm careful to get all the parts back. It's all there, but that frog is dead and he's going to stay dead. I'm not going to be able to bring him back to life. So something's missing, and science cannot explain that. Life is missing from that frog. So there's a number of problems with the origin of life. So one of the other things that you have to do if you're going to be an evolutionist is you're going to have to explain how life started, but you're also going to have to explain how does this work. Okay, I'm saying that one creature changes into another. In other words, a fish develops legs and crawls out on land and becomes an amphibian. How does that work? There's got to be some way that works. Darwin had it all figured out. He had one mechanism for this to work, and that was natural selection, survival of the fittest. It doesn't work. Just flat out doesn't work. Natural selection, creationists believe in natural selection, except that it's a meaningless term. We think of, okay, the smartest are going to succeed, the fastest are going to survive, the heaviest are going to whatever. That's how we think in survival of the fittest. But it doesn't always work that way. If you're one of the slowest, you may miss the plane that crashes when it takes off. So you're surviving. It only means that you survive. And so it has no meaning. Now, can it change populations? Yes, it can. Because there may be genetics involved in a group that will survive because of natural selection. You may get color changes, you may get size changes. This is not evolution. This is genetic variation. And we can't even begin to imagine the amount of variation that's in genetics in a certain group or in any group. And so there's a tremendous amount there, but it can only go so far. It can't cross a genetic boundary and become something else. It comes up against a brick wall. We're never going to have a 900-pound tomato. It just isn't going to happen. The genetics are not there for that to happen. But this is where the confusion comes in. Now, evolutionists today realize that Darwin did not have enough. He could not do what had to be done in evolution. So they added, today we're not Darwinism, we're neo-Darwinism, is what it's officially called today. And they added mutations to the mix. And this was a giant step forward. If you want to get change on a reliable basis, you rely on mistakes. It's never worked for me. So I don't know what's wrong. I'm probably making too many mistakes. But that's what a mutation is a mistake. By definition, something goes wrong and something bad happens. So this is going to drive us from one creature to another. Well, there's a lot of confusion on mutations and evolutionary change. And I have people coming in the museum and they'll say, I know evolution is true because I've seen it happen. And so, oh, that's nice. But, how does this take place? Well, they'll always bring up the dogs. And we've got 350, and I'm just in the ballpark, 350 different kinds of dogs if you count the poodle. And so, you've got, but here's all these different kinds of dogs. And that's an example of evolution, because we started with this wolf-like animal several million years ago, and now we've got all of these different kinds of creatures showing that evolution is progressing. Well, of course, I say, okay, they're still dogs, but that doesn't slow anybody down. They say, well, yeah, they're dogs, but in this short amount of time, we have went from a wolf to a Chihuahua or to a Saint Bernard. Look at the amount of change we've had over this period of time. Now, visualize 50 million years from now, that dog will change into something else, because he's changed so much in this period of time that he will change into something else, given 50 million years and keeping this rate of change going. Not a problem at all. Well, I think there's a problem. We've never seen it happen. It's not in the fossil record, and it's certainly not in the genetics that we observe, but that doesn't seem to slow anybody down. But the fact is, dogs are still dogs. And so when they cease to be dogs and they change into something else, give me a call. I'll talk to you. I'll assume something's wrong. But another one that was kind of a problem in the early 50s, there was they had a fly problem, a real bad fly problem, particularly in the Midwest. And they had a chemical called DDT, and this really was effective. So they sprayed the flies with DDT, and they really knocked them out. The flies were on the defensive, and they were just getting slaughtered. So the flies mutated and evolved into a type of fly which was resistant to DDT. And this was the proof that evolution was true, because here's these flies, they've had enough of DDT, and so they evolve into a fly that's resistant to DDT, and bang, evolution is true. Well, the creationists were scratching their heads. They knew there was something wrong with this. This can't be the case. So they started looking at it, and what was actually happening was, in that original fly population, with all of the genetics available there, you've got flies in that original population that were already resistant to DDT. Now, when you wipe out the other flies have the habit of reproducing rapidly, and you don't even notice your population has changed. You've got a population that is resistant to DDT, and it just goes on as usual. They haven't changed evolutionary-wise. They have simply switched genetics, or lost genetics, actually. They've lost the genetics that before was not resistant to DDT. And so that's simply an example of variation in genetics. And we develop another spray. Well, somewhere in that fly population, there's a fly that's resistant to that spray. And we go through the whole process again. And flies have a huge genetic pool. And so we really are not going to get ahead of them. They've got somebody in that pool that's resistant to whatever we come up with. And even though it looks like evolution, it's not. So now we go to a tougher one, and that is the bacteria in the hospitals. And they are driving the hospitals and the doctors nuts because they are changing. And this is a different deal. And now in some cases, there's different kinds of bacteria. In some cases, it's just like the flies. They have such a tremendous, and bacteria do have a tremendous genetic pool, so they have variations that are already resistant to whatever drug is being administered to get rid of them. That is the case in a number of instances, but there are instances where these bacteria, it's not a genetic change, it's a mutation. And the mutation is actually taking place, and it makes these bacteria resistant to the streptomycins. Now that's pure evolution. That is evolution in action. And the creationists, okay, there's an important point, and I'm just throwing that out just to see if I get a reaction. It's not evolution. It appears to be, but what's happening is, you're right, they are still bacteria. They haven't changed into something else, but an evolutionist is going to argue, okay, we've gotten this small change, we are on our way. And it doesn't take much to excite an evolutionist. So here we go. We're on our way. 800 billion more changes and we got something else. So, but you have to admit, they have the change and it is effective. It makes them resistant to the streptomycin. Okay, but what really happens here, when the bacteria is in there causing problems, we shoot the streptomycin in to get them. The streptomycin goes for the bacteria and it attacks a spot on the bacteria where it latches on. And when it attaches to that spot, it prevents reproductive activity in the bacteria. So it latches onto the spot. Now the bacteria, when it mutated, lost the spot. Now that's crucial because the bacteria did not have any, or the streptomycin did not have any place to latch onto, so the bacteria then continued to survive. Now what actually happened here, number one, was that the bacteria lost information. For evolution to work, we have to add information. You can't go downhill, you have to add and go uphill. So number one, the bacteria lost information. Number two, the bacteria also lost a certain amount of vigor. Anytime there's a mutation, you lose something. And the bacteria becomes sluggish in its reproductive capability, and it becomes just overall sluggish. And so even though it was still a pain in the neck for the hospitals, it still survived. And still, but it was slower and it was weaker. But still, it was not a genetic variation, it was a mutation that caused it. Now, when something loses information, we really can't call that, I mean, it's good for the bacteria, I guess, because he survived. But it's not the type of change that evolution demands, and that is the addition of information and an uphill movement. And so these things are out there, particularly in bacteria, but they are not evolution in any sense of the word. The other thing that scientists have tried to do, and they've been doing this for the last 70, 80 years, is they have tried to create mutations in different animals, particularly the fruit flies. And they have bombarded fruit flies mercilessly for the last 70 years. And they will get variations that are unbelievable in fruit flies. Extra wings, extra eyes, extra legs, missing parts here, everything imaginable in a fruit fly, grotesque images of fruit flies everywhere. And yet, every time they stop bombarding them with X-rays or nuclear or radioactive or whatever they do, guess what happens to the fruit flies? They go back to being ordinary, everyday fruit flies. Just, I'm glad that's over. And that's what we're looking at. They just keep going back to what they were. You can't get a change that grabs a hold and changes it into a mouse. They don't do that. And they've been, anytime a nuclear accident happens or anything like that, they're expecting changes in people. We'll see these mutations. And we get all kinds of diseases and all kinds of reactions from nuclear exposure, but that's it. Nobody changes into something else. We don't get, I'm not sure about zombies. We may get some of those if they're around. But for the most part, as far as I'm aware, they don't change into anything else. So that's the mechanism problem. And mutations in general, and I don't have time to go into an explanation of this, and in addition to that, I'm not sure I understand all of it anyway, but mutations have a serious problem. Number one, most creationists consider them to be bad. It's really difficult to come up with a good mutation. There's some examples, but they're not legitimate examples. But let's say that you had a population and you can make a mutation that moves it forward, and it's a large mutation. It makes a large difference. Those usually wind up killing the creature that it's involved with. You take a small mutation and it can't change fast enough to affect the whole population. They just can't do it mathematically. The same thing goes with a mutation working in a large group and a mutation working in a small group. They do not have, mathematically, they can't take over the group. The group either disappears or it's too large, and so mutations have a serious problem. Even if you could assume there were some good ones and you could get enough of them, you can't overcome the obstacles that are put in the way of it. And so the bottom line is, you cannot change populations with mutations. Number one, mutation is a mistake. If I sit down to read a novel or to write a novel and I hire a chimpanzee to do that for me at the typewriter, I've got a long wait. He's going to struggle. And you can multiply that by millions and billions when you try to use mutations in any form, good or bad, to get a change. It is not going to work. So the next thing, and this is the one that we're buried in, and I've mentioned it, is time. Creationists believe in thousands of years. Evolutionists believe in billions of years. They have to. They have no choice, because they need that time to change one thing into another. So they're locked in. They have no choice. There is a difference there. Thousands and billions. We're not going to come to an agreement unless we just cave in and say you're right. It's not something that meshes. We say thousands, they say billions. We can't agree on that, regardless of how we try. So, as a creationist, I believe in a world that was created 6,000 years ago. Where do I get that idea? Where does it come from? And that's a question you're probably going to get asked. Well, it's in the Bible. If you turn to Hezekiah 1:5, it says 6,000 years ago. Actually, it doesn't. So, it doesn't say in the Bible 6,000 years ago God created the earth. It does talk about a 6-day creation, but it doesn't say 6,000 years ago. So I'm just pulling numbers out of thin air with 6,000 years. Not really. There are genealogies, particularly up to the flood. It's written in stone. The genealogies are locked in. It's 1,656 years, I think, from creation to the flood. Now, after that, there's a genealogy that takes us a ways, and then we have Abraham, and there's verses that jump us along. And when we get to the time of Christ, we've went about 4,000 years. And then, of course, we're 2,000 years past that. You can argue in various areas of this, and I don't, because as long as it's a 1,000-year thing, 10,000 or less, I'm not going to argue. I don't care. But I will argue about billions of years, because that changes the whole thing. And I'm not very tolerant when it comes to billions of years. So, it's in the Bible. If you take time to find it, it's there, the verses, and study this thing out, you'll see a clear 1,000-year format there. Now, where does evolution come into the picture? Where in the world do they get billions of years outside of the fact that they have to have it? They're stuck with it. It started out time and chance. Well, heavy on the time, because chance needs a lot of shots at creating something, and it takes time. And so they have to have time. Today, they're figuring 13.7 billion years ago was the Big Bang, give or take a couple of weeks. And so it used to be 20 billion years. They cut it down to 15 billion years. Now they're down to 13.7. And so, pick a number you like. It's going to be there somewhere. We may get down to 10 billion. I'm not sure. I don't think we're going to get down to thousands. So where did they come up with these numbers? And this, in a way, is kind of a mystery. It was to me. I was never told in a geology class. I was just simply told this is the way it is. Where did it come from? We didn't question that. And radioactive dating, I'm sure you're familiar with that. You go to a movie with a date and she glows in the dark. So, a little different kind of radioactive dating. But it's, you're familiar with this. This is the reason why we're stuck with millions of years, because this really hammered it down. Radioactive dating coming in the early 1900s, in the 20s, started coming in 30s, and this really nailed down the billions of years. And the creationists were really on the defensive, because this is science. And before we get to that, billions of years were around in Darwin's time. There was a guy called Lyell who came up with the idea of uniformitarianism, slow processes we see today back through time, take them back several billion years, and you get the changes that we see. Chance and random chance and time. And so it's been around. But where did this, particularly the geologic column, and the geologic column is the Bible for evolution. Nobody messes with the geologic column. This is the straightforward map for time and fossils in the evolutionary record. So if you're not familiar with the geologic column, it's a chart which shows rock layers around the world. It started in England, spread into Europe and then the United States, and they've tried to take it clear around the world with limited success. But what actually happened was during the 1800s, these guys started noticing the fossils, and they weren't the first, but they noticed them, and they noticed that they had fossils that appeared to be more primitive in the lower rock layers and more advanced in some of the upper rock layers. And they noticed that there was differences in thickness in these rock layers, and they noticed that they could trace these rock layers from England into France and across Europe and different things like that. They could correlate these fossils in one place with fossils in the other place in the rock layers. And so they built this geologic column. At the bottom, the oldest rock layers that contain fossils was the Cambrian, 600 million years ago. And they pulled that number out of thin air. This was 600 million years ago because they said it was 600 million years ago. And who's going to argue with them? That's what it was. And so above the Cambrian then, they come up to all the way up. You've got the Silurian, the Devonian, your coal ages, the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, the dinosaur ages, Triassic, Jurassic, if you've seen Jurassic Park and all of that, and then into the more mammal ages as we get closer to humans, top to bottom. So you got a 600 million year old rock layer chart here, which has fossils in it. Well, they use the fossils in that to date the rocks. And then when that doesn't work, they use the rocks to date the fossils. Some people call that circular reasoning. Geologists call that circular reasoning, but they don't care. That they have to do it. And so that's the way it is, and it is, that rock column is a fact. Those dates, even though they pulled and they assigned those dates to it, that's the way it is. Those dates are there, and since middle 1800s, there were about 6 different guys that assigned these dates to the different rock layers. To today, there has been very little change in that geologic column. Now, in the process, we have this radioactive dating coming in, and this is the scientific approach to rock layers and the age of the Earth, is radioactive dating. This tells us exactly where we're at. So evidently, these guys were pretty sharp when they assigned these dates to these rock layers, because it hasn't changed since we've had radioactive dating. Those dates are still there in the same order, at the same time frame. So, what is radioactive dating? And it is a scientific procedure. It really is. They set a rock on the table, and they've actually got these, and I can't even think of the name of the machine now, and I know what it is. The spectrometers, I think, is what it's called. Gets down and counts molecules in these things. And so they can determine the percentage of radioactive material that is deteriorating into the daughter element, parent and daughter. And so you've got a material like uranium, which is radioactive, and it will deteriorate or change into lead. And it's a little more complex than that. It actually goes through thorium, but it does eventually change into lead, and it does it at a fixed rate. So you can put that on the table and watch it for 20 years. And you can determine how much of the uranium in that rock changes into lead in that period of time. And if half of it changes into lead in a certain amount of time, that's the half-life of the rock. So let's say, just for simplicity's sake, actually the half-life of uranium, and there's several different uraniums, but the one uranium that I'm talking about that changes into a particular type of lead, and there are several kinds of lead, is 1 billion years. That's the half-life determined by studying this rock for, let's say, 20 years. And they can determine the rate of deterioration of uranium into lead, and they can determine the half-life. So I have a rock here that is a 10-pound rock, and 5 pounds of it is uranium and 5 pounds of it is lead. How old is that rock? The half-life of uranium is 1 billion years. So how old is the rock?
Isn't that assuming that it was all uranium to start with? What if it was partly lead to start with?
You're stealing my thunder.
Oh,
Evolutionists can make assumptions, we can't. But back to my question, we have this rock sitting here with 5 pounds of uranium, 5 pounds of lead. How old is this rock? It's 1 billion years old, because half of it has changed to lead. Okay, from my point of view, making an assumption.
Okay.
So, okay, so I'm looking at this rock and I see half of it's uranium, half of it's lead. That means I started with 10 pounds of uranium. It has deteriorated into half lead, half uranium. It takes 1 billion years to do that. The rock is 1 billion years old. Okay, I have a 12-pound rock sitting here. 9 pounds of it is lead, 3 pounds of it is uranium. How old is that rock?
More than 5? More than 1 billion.
More than 1 billion. How much more? Yeah, yeah, and there's going to be a test when we're done. Okay, 2 billion years old, because we started with 12. After 1 billion, we had 6 and 6. After 2 billion, we had 3 and 9. The 6 divided again into that. Now, we don't have to, I mean, whether you do the math or not is irrelevant. The process, the thing you need to realize is that as we lose radioactive material, the uranium, as the uranium amount gets smaller, the rock appears older. Does that make sense? With lesser parent rock, which is the radioactive uranium, the less we have of that, the older the rock looks. Okay, that's what you need to grasp. The more of the daughter rock we have, the lead, the older the rock appears. Okay, those two, and those two are just opposites. You know, less uranium, more age. More lead, more age. That's the idea. And this works. It works down to the millisecond and down to the milligram. It is science, and it does work. I had a guy stop at a museum who was a doctor of nuclear medicine from Pennsylvania. And he uses radioactive material every day. He's a heart doctor. He uses radioactive material to inject into the patients to trace blood vessels, to see where, evidently blockage, whatever. He uses a radioactive material that has a half-life of 15 minutes. So, and he was a creationist, an ardent creationist, and he was there for 2 hours. I mean, he's up here and I'm down here. It's just fascinating to talk to. But he told me that he gets up every morning, he goes to work, and he puts together the dosage for his patients that day. And if he's got like 6 patients every hour, he has to compute exactly how much of that radioactive material to put in. Now, the first one is easy. He puts that in, and that's what he's got. The second one, he's an hour later, so he's got to figure 4 15-minute time periods that this is going to deteriorate at the exact rate, and so he has to put much more radioactive material in, and it gets worse as the day goes along. So he has to compute all that out and put this in, and it works. You know, if he makes a mistake, he's going to have a patient literally glowing, and you know, if he gets too much in there. And so he has to be accurate with this, and he is, and it does work. Okay, so now I'm going to throw out the question that was messed up for me. So, what other problems with radioactive dating that you can think of? And that is an excellent, we'll start with that. That's an excellent observation. How do we, and I think this is what you were saying, how do we know what we started with? That's what you were saying? Okay, I'm sitting here saying I got a rock. I'm looking at it, it's 50% uranium, 50% lead. How do I know what I started with? You know, did I start with a rock that was 100% uranium? Well, maybe not. You know, it may have been anything. There may have been all kinds of stuff in there. that's gone. Okay, that's one thing, and I'll come back to that again. That's a valid argument. We don't know what we started with. And one thing along those lines also is that there may be a lot of lead, and remember, a lot of lead means what? An old age, right? Okay, so there may have been a lot of lead in this rock to start with, because all lead does not come from uranium. There's natural lead that occurs. It doesn't necessarily come from deteriorating uranium. So we could have had uranium and lead in that original rock that didn't come from the uranium. So that's a serious problem. Can you think of any others? Oh.
Wouldn't you have more lead at the bottom layers?
That's more, I mean, that's possible, but I don't think it's a problem. Yeah, because that depends more, it depends more on the rock itself. So you're saying you'd get more lead so the bottom layers would appear older. Yeah, because we find lead in the top layers too. You know, and I don't, to my knowledge, there's not enough difference to make a difference. So, okay, good.
My understanding was that during the breakdown, there are a number of different products. It doesn't start as, say, pure uranium and then just lead. My understanding was that there are a number of isotopes, if you will. I'm not sure of the correct term, but that was my understanding, or that's what I had heard, that they looked at all these different factors to try and make a determination. And even that was, the way I heard it, was educated guess.
And I'm not sure, you know, there are a number of radioactive, uranium lead's not the only one. We've got rubidium, strontium, we've got potassium, argon, and 2 or 3 others. But they all give bad results. And what I'm saying is we get out of the lab and we go out in the field, it doesn't work. It doesn't even come close to working. And so that's, now, back to, in a sense, why doesn't it work? And before we really realized this, you know, creationists had these questions. And of course, the one that normally comes up first is, was this rate of decay always the same? You go back 1 billion years, was it always the same rate of decay? Could that change? And the fact is, creationists have changed the rate of decay of radioactive material in the lab by using temperature and pressure and magnetic change. And they can drastically change the rate of decay. Now, there was an event in the Bible that might have provided some of that. The flood could have definitely provided differences in pressure, temperature, and magnetic field. You know, that could have changed the rate of decay. There's another problem that I think is the major problem with radioactive dating today, and that is removal of the radioactive material. And all radioactive compounds are extremely soluble in water. Now, I can think of an event in the Bible that contained quite a bit of water. So, the flood. Creationists in the lab have taken a sample of potassium, radioactive potassium, and they have leached 75% of the radioactive material out of that rock in 45 minutes. That gives that rock the appearance of great age. You know, just bang, just like that. The flood would have been, it would have had the temperature, which would have raised the ability to leach out radioactive material. All of that working would have given these rocks the appearance of great age. Now, what happens when we look at rocks in the field? And this is where it gets kind of interesting. And creationists have a number of geologists. Steve Austin, and I can't think of any of the other guys. There's a bunch of them. There's a half a dozen of these guys which do a lot of work in this field. And they are familiar with radioactive dating. They're familiar with the process, and they're familiar with what happens. And they have done tests at Mount St. Helens, which was a gift to creationists. And this thing erupted. Rocks, when they come up, either as lava or ash or whatever. When they reach the surface, if there's radioactive material there, the clock is set when it gets to the surface. And the radioactive material starts to decay. So at that point, the rocks start to decay, the radioactive part. So the clock is basically set in motion. Well, rocks that come up from volcanoes, such as Hawaii and Mount St. Helens, should be registering dates in the very young age. I mean, a year, 2 years, you could put up with 10 or 12 years, if that's what it registered. They've tested the rocks in Hawaiian lavas that come up and Mount St. Helens and a number of other volcanoes, and they get dates like 150 million years, 250 million years, 350 million years on rocks that just formed, and they watched them form. Something's wrong with the dating method. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. And that's what they observe. Scientists themselves, evolutionists, have said several times 50% is a great percentage for a radioactive date, and the other 50% is highly suspect. So what they do is they test a rock. If they don't like the date, they throw it out. And there were a number of times I wished I could have did that in lab. Not necessarily testing rocks, but this result isn't working. It's gone. So that's not science, but it's how it works. They get a number they like, they grab onto it, and that's the number that we're stuck with. And so the bottom line is it doesn't work. Okay, let's flip over then. That's the evolution side. What have the creationists got to say then on their side? And actually they have quite a bit to say. The one that I find the most exciting is the RATE team from ICR, Institute for Creation Research, 11 scientists. Amongst the group, they've got 16 doctorates. And these guys went into the Grand Canyon, and they're studying granites. And in the granites are tiny zircons. It's a little gemstone, but these zircons are like 1/8 of an inch big, and they're buried in these granites. Granites are bedrock, considered to be original rock in the creation. So they bring these granites up, and in these zircons, in the granites, is trapped helium. Now, helium escapes from anything. You put it in a balloon, it goes to the ceiling, you wait 3 days, and it's on the floor because the helium escapes out. Put it in a glass container, it will eventually go through the glass and escape. Put it in anything, helium will escape eventually. And that's true of zircons. So what they do is they bring these rocks up and they look at the zircons, and it has helium in them, and they can determine the rate of escape of the helium from those zircons. And they do that. And they get some astounding results. They still work on the half-life of the helium escaping from the zircons. Similar to radioactive dating, except that they're working on the escape of helium from these zircons. And the dates they've gotten themselves, and they send their test results to secular labs also, who get the same results, they come up with a date for the age of the Earth of 6,000 years. And here's the interesting thing. Every time they run the test, they get the same result. That to me, what a concept. It comes out the same every time. Yes?
I'm sorry, I have a question, it's just eating at me. If 6,000 years seems to be the time frame that we keep going back to, which I believe, by the way, but if Jesus walked the earth 5,000 years ago, where was the Jurassic period? I mean, we dig up fossils of dinosaurs. When would they have walked the earth then? I mean, 500 years before Jesus was here? I mean, I'm just curious. I'm dying to know
Okay, that's a great question, and I get that question all the time. What do we do with the dinosaurs? Basically. Yeah, they're here. Let me go ahead with this, and then I'll come back to that, because it does tie in. It ties in. But I want to finish up with the creationist side for a young Earth, and then I'll come back to the dinosaurs. Okay? Nope, no problem. But there is evidence for a young Earth, and to me, the helium escaping from zircons is tremendous. Now, it does suffer from the same problem that radioactive dating suffers from. We cannot go back in time and say that that rate of escape of helium from zircons was always constant. We can't do that. But no evolutionist can challenge that, because they do the same thing with radioactive dating. So they can't challenge it. Now, we may or may not be right because of that possibility that that rate of escape was not the same. But we're not answerable to an evolutionist for that problem. So that's, okay, there's another kind of interesting thing that helps our creationists out, and that is carbon-14, believe it or not. There's a lot of confusion about carbon-14. I went into a rock shop one time and bought a piece of amber, and the lady said, oh, this is a great piece of amber. It's 100 million years old based on carbon-14 dating. And I didn't say anything, but I knew right away she didn't have a clue what she was talking about, because carbon-14 only dates to 90,000 years. It has a half-life of 5,700 years. And after so many half-lives, which takes it out to about 90,000 years, you don't have any carbon-14 left to test. You can't possibly pick it up after that period of time. And so it's a short test thing based on things that have carbon in them, basically living things. But the interesting thing is, in South Africa, in the diamond mines, they're bringing up diamonds from rocks that are dated to be 2 to 3 billion years old, according to radioactive dating. They bring these diamonds up, and creationists are grabbing onto these things and testing them, and guess what they're finding in the diamonds? Carbon-14. There should be no carbon-14 whatsoever in a diamond, because 90,000 years and it's gone. Now, 90,000 years is not a friendly number for creationists, but it's certainly not a friendly number for an evolutionist, who's already on the line for a 2 billion year old rock. And so that's destroying this idea of years in one fell swoop. So there are a number, in fact, there's like 154 natural things around the Earth that show a young Earth. My favorite one is the moon. The moon is moving away from the Earth at a rate of 1.25 inches a year. This has been measured back 200 or 300 years. And that is pretty constant. So the moon and the Earth are in very precarious balance. You know, the moon gets too far away, it's gone. Gets too close, we're gone. So one way or the other. But it's moving away. Okay, if we reverse that process and we go back to last year, the moon was 1.25 inches closer. We go back 10 years ago, it was 11 inches closer or whatever, certain number closer. We go back 6,000 years. We're talking about a distance of 276,000 miles. It's a long ways out there. We go back 6,000 years, we're still not talking about a distance that's going to throw us out of balance. We go back 50 million years, we got a problem. All of a sudden, we got the moon in our face. It's right there. Doesn't work. Just doesn't work. So, and there are a number of things. The sun is another one. The sun is throwing off several tons of hydrogen every year. They know, they've measured that. Take that back in time and add that hydrogen on, and we go back 6,000 years, it doesn't make the snap of a finger. We don't know the difference. You go back 50 million years, all of a sudden Mercury, Venus, and the Earth are vaporized because we have a sun so huge with all of that added back on that we're toast. That, again, suffers from the same problem. We don't know that those rates are constant going back in time. So it's not pure science, but it's a good indication. You know, we can't pound the table and say this is a scientific fact, but we can say it indicates a young Earth, and there are any number of these that indicate a young Earth. So one of my favorites is of course, for an old Earth argument, is caves. And if you've been in a cave, you've heard this speech, stalactites, stalagmites, billions of years, and I'm drifting away. And Carlsbad Caverns had a sign in front of their cave years ago that said, "Welcome to Carlsbad Caverns, home of the 30-million-year-old stalactites and stalagmites." They had to take the sign down. They had an 18-inch stalactite growing on the sign. It's embarrassing. So, you know, it doesn't take millions of years. There's a place in Kentucky. A lady had a storage area for whiskey in the basement and had oak ridges or beams going across. And when she died, they went in there and there were huge stalactites growing from the beams. You know, it just doesn't take billions of years. It can happen very rapidly. So, but let me go back, and I know I'm running out of time here and I'll quit, but the dinosaur question is one that I'll mention just briefly here. Dinosaurs were created right along with the other animals. They were on the ark, I think. As a creationist, I firmly believe they were on the ark. You don't have to have a 125-foot Apatosaurus on there. They could have taken young ones. You don't have to have 2 million species on the ark. You can have kinds, which narrows it down considerably, probably around 2,000 different kinds. And with all of that, you get a manageable amount on there. And I think after the flood, probably conditions were not such that the dinosaurs survived all that well. They struggled, and we very well could have some dinosaurs around today. And of course, the word dinosaur didn't come into existence until 1867, I think it was. Before that, they were called dragons. You know, look in the Bible. You'll find dragons all over the place in the Bible. Job 40 and 41 gives a couple of descriptions of some pretty impressive dinosaurs, I think. So I think they definitely were around until a point. Could be around today. That's not an argument I like to get into, but you know, they definitely were around. I think when there's too many pictures around, there's too many stories around, there's just too much evidence that man was associated with dinosaurs. And so the idea of Jurassic, Triassic is totally a red herring, because those don't exist in a creationist time frame. You know, you have these animals all existing together in the same time frame of the last 4,500 years. So I'm going to shut up. If you want to, I brought some fossils here, and if you want to hang around, you know, you're welcome to look at them, and I certainly will talk about them if you want to. So, but,
Thank you.
yeah.